Berlin, January 17, 1940. The snow falls soft and soundless over the Reich main security office on Prince Albrechtstrasse. Inside, beneath the vaulted ceilings of what was once an art school, a young man sits hunched over a wooden desk, scattered with intercepted radio transcripts, aerial reconnaissance photographs, and decoded Allied communications. His name is Wilhelm Hartmann, 26 years old, freshly recruited from Heidelberg University, where he studied Slavic languages and strategic geography. The air smells of tobacco smoke and mimeograph ink. His hands, pale and steady, move across the documents with the precision of a surgeon. He does not yet know that everything he believes about this war, about Germany's invincibility, about the righteousness of the Reich, will be systematically dismantled by the very intelligence he helps collect. He does not know that he will survive the war, that he will spend decades afterward trying to reconcile what he knew with what he did, and that his testimony, recorded on magnetic tape in a windowless room in Washington, D.C., in 1961, will become one of the most revealing documents about the inner workings of Nazi intelligence ever compiled. The Reich Main Security Office, or Reichssicherheitshauptamt, represented the nerve center of Nazi Germany's intelligence apparatus, established in September 1939. Through the merger of the security service and the security police, it coordinated everything from foreign espionage to domestic surveillance, from the monitoring of resistance movements to the collection of strategic military intelligence. At its peak, the RSHA employed over 50,000 personnel across 7 main departments, each dedicated to a specific aspect of state security and intelligence gathering. Department 66, where Hartmann served, focused exclusively on foreign intelligence operations, tracking Allied military movements, assessing industrial capacity, and attempting to penetrate enemy intelligence services. The men who worked in these windowless offices believed themselves to be fighting an existential battle for German survival, convinced that they were surrounded by enemies determined to destroy their nation. They believed in the mythology of German superiority, in the efficiency of their systems, in the inevitability of victory. Wilhelm Hartmann believed all of this when he arrived in Berlin in late 1939. He had been selected for his linguistic abilities and his analytical mind, recommended by his professors, who saw in him the qualities the Reich needed: intelligence, discipline, ideological commitment. He had joined the Nazi Party in 1937, not out of fanaticism, but out of pragmatism, understanding that membership opened doors to academic and professional advancement. He had attended the rallies, had raised his arm in salute, had absorbed the rhetoric about Lebensraum and racial destiny. He expected to contribute to a swift, decisive German victory, to use his skills in service of what he genuinely believed was a defensive war against British imperialism and Soviet barbarism. What he encountered instead, day after day, document after document, was a systematic revelation of German weakness disguised as strength, of improvisation masquerading as planning, of desperation dressed up as destiny. The intelligence reports that crossed Hartmann's desk in those early months of 1940 told a story at odds with the public propaganda. While Joseph Goebbels proclaimed German invincibility through radio broadcasts and newsreels, the classified assessments painted a more troubling picture. Germany's oil reserves, according to Wehrmacht economic planners, would sustain full-scale operations for approximately 6 months without access to Romanian supplies. Steel production, despite the seizure of Czech industrial facilities, remained below projected requirements for a prolonged multi-front conflict. The Kriegsmarine, Germany's navy, possessed fewer than 60 operational submarines at the war's outset, woefully inadequate for the sustained Atlantic campaign envisioned by Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz. Most revealing of all were the reports on British industrial capacity and American material support. which indicated production levels that dwarfed German output. In one particularly sobering document dated March 1940, an economic intelligence assessment calculated that American automotive factories alone, if converted to war production, could manufacture more aircraft engines in a single year than all of Germany's purpose-built aviation plants combined. Hartmann read these figures, checked them against source documents, and filed them away with growing unease. But it was not the statistics that first shook Hartmann's faith. It was the lies. In his role as an intelligence analyst, he was privy to both the raw intelligence and the edited versions that were passed up the chain of command. He watched as unfavorable assessments were revised, as pessimistic projections were adjusted to meet ideological expectations, as inconvenient truths were simply omitted from final reports. When intelligence indicated that the Soviet Red Army possessed significantly more tanks and aircraft than previously estimated, the numbers were quietly reduced in the reports sent to Hitler's headquarters. When aerial reconnaissance revealed the rapid expansion of British fighter production following the fall of France, the photographs were presented with commentary emphasizing quality problems rather than quantity increases. The intelligence apparatus of the Third Reich, Hartmann realized, was not designed to provide accurate information for decision-making. It was designed to confirm pre-existing beliefs, to validate strategic choices already made, to tell the leadership what it wanted to hear rather than what it needed to know. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 brought this dysfunction into catastrophic focus. Hartmann's department had been tasked with assessing Soviet military capabilities, industrial infrastructure, and potential for sustained resistance. The official intelligence estimate prepared under pressure from the highest levels of leadership predicted that the Red Army would collapse within 8 to 10 weeks of the initial assault. The Soviet Union, according to these assessments, was a rotten structure that would crumble at the first hard blow. Hartmann had participated in preparing these estimates, collating reports from agents in the field, analyzing captured Soviet documents, studying railway networks and industrial concentrations. But he had also seen the dissenting opinions, the reports from more experienced analysts warning that Soviet industrial capacity east of the Urals remained largely unknown, that Russian forces had demonstrated formidable resilience against the Finns during the Winter War despite their tactical incompetence, that the vast distances and harsh climate of the Soviet interior posed logistical challenges for which the Wehrmacht was unprepared. These warnings were systematically downplayed or dismissed. The ideological conviction that Slavic peoples were racially inferior and therefore incapable of sustained resistance overwhelmed objective analysis. By December 1941, when German forces ground to a halt outside Moscow in temperatures reaching -40 degrees Celsius, the gap between intelligence assessment and battlefield reality had become unbridgeable. Hartmann received reports from frontline intelligence officers describing Soviet counterattacks by formations that German intelligence had assessed as destroyed weeks earlier. Fresh Siberian divisions, equipped for winter warfare, appeared seemingly from nowhere, their existence unreported by German reconnaissance. Soviet industrial evacuation, the systematic dismantling and relocation of entire factories to the Urals and beyond, proceeded on a scale that German intelligence had deemed impossible. And then came Pearl Harbor, and with it, the entry of the United States into the war. Hartmann pulled the American industrial assessments he had filed away 18 months earlier and understood, with sickening clarity, that the war was already lost. Germany was now fighting the combined industrial might of the Soviet Union, the British Empire, and the United States. No amount of tactical brilliance or ideological conviction could overcome the mathematics of production. The object that came to symbolize this realization for Hartmann was absurdly mundane: a ballpoint pen. In early 1943, after the catastrophe at Stalingrad, German intelligence captured a substantial cache of American Lend-Lease supplies being shipped to Soviet forces. Among the military equipment, the ammunition, the trucks, and the canned food were boxes of disposable ballpoint pens. These pens, manufactured by the thousands in American factories, represented a technology that German industry had not yet mastered for mass production. They were inexpensive, reliable, and ubiquitous in American military logistics. Hartmann held one of these pens, rolled it between his fingers, and understood what it meant. America was so wealthy, so industrially advanced, that it could manufacture sophisticated writing instruments as disposable items, could ship them across the Atlantic Ocean by the crate, could equip its allies with tools that German officers still treated as prized possessions. If America could do this with pens, what could it do with tanks, with aircraft, with artillery? The pen became his talisman, his secret reminder of the truth he could not speak aloud. He carried it throughout the rest of the war, using it to annotate intelligence reports that grew increasingly desperate, increasingly detached from reality. By 1944, the intelligence work of the RSHA had devolved into fantasy. Hartmann's department produced assessments of Allied intentions based more on wishful thinking than evidence. They predicted that the Anglo-American alliance would fracture due to competing imperial interests, that the Soviets would agree to a separate peace once they had regained their pre-war territories, that Germany's new wonder weapons would turn the tide of the war. The V-1 and V-2 rocket campaigns against Britain were presented in internal documents as potentially war-winning, despite intelligence indicating that their military impact was negligible compared to their resource cost. The intelligence estimates for the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, Germany's last major attack in the West, predicted that American forces would collapse under pressure, that their will to fight was weak, that their multi-ethnic army lacked cohesion. Hartmann read these assessments and said nothing. What was the point? The machinery of self-deception had become total. To question the intelligence was to question the ideology, and to question the ideology was treason. The end came for Hartmann in April 1945, as Soviet artillery began its final bombardment of Berlin. The RSHA offices had been evacuated piecemeal, with senior officials fleeing westward while junior personnel were ordered to destroy documents and prepare for a last stand that existed only in propaganda. Hartmann, methodical to the end, spent his final days in Berlin burning intelligence files in a courtyard while Russian shells fell closer with each hour. But he did not burn everything. In his briefcase, hidden beneath official travel documents that he hoped would allow him to pass through Allied checkpoints, he carried a selection of intelligence reports, assessments, and memoranda that he believed would prove valuable to whoever won the war. He carried evidence of what the Reich had known, and when it had known it, evidence of the systematic distortion of intelligence, evidence of the gulf between Nazi propaganda and Nazi reality. And he carried the American ballpoint pen. Hartmann surrendered to American forces in Bavaria in May 1945. After months in a prisoner-of-war camp, he was identified as a former intelligence analyst and transferred to American intelligence services for interrogation. The Americans, desperate to understand the Soviet Union's capabilities and intentions as the Cold War began to crystallize, were intensely interested in anyone who had worked on Eastern intelligence for the Germans. Hartmann was thoroughly debriefed, his information cross-referenced against captured documents and other testimony. He proved truthful, detailed, and remarkably clear-eyed about German failures. Unlike many former Nazi officials who spent the post-war years minimizing their involvement or justifying their actions, Hartmann spoke with what his interrogators described as clinical detachment about the systematic failures of German intelligence and the ideological blinders that had doomed the Reich. What Hartmann revealed in those interrogations, and later in the comprehensive interview recorded in 1961, painted a devastating portrait of Nazi decision-making. He described how racial ideology corrupted intelligence analysis, how the institutional culture of the Reich rewarded optimistic assessments and punished realistic ones, how the absence of independent verification mechanisms allowed errors to compound, how the leadership's refusal to accept unfavorable information created an echo chamber of delusion. He detailed specific instances where accurate intelligence had been available but ignored. The warning signs before the Soviet winter counteroffensive of 1941, the indications of Allied preparations for the Normandy invasion, the evidence of American atomic bomb development that German intelligence had dismissed as propaganda. He explained how the rigid hierarchical structure of Nazi governance meant that Hitler often received intelligence that had passed through multiple layers of ideological filtering, each layer removing information that contradicted the Führer's preconceptions. But Hartmann's most valuable insights concerned the comparison between German and Allied intelligence methodologies. He had spent years studying Allied operations, trying to penetrate their decision-making processes, and he had come to recognize qualities that the German system lacked. American intelligence, he observed, seemed to value dissenting opinions, to build redundancy into their assessments, to separate intelligence analysis from policymaking in ways that reduced political pressure on analysts. British intelligence demonstrated a willingness to change assessments based on new information, to admit previous errors, to maintain professional skepticism about their own conclusions. These were not merely technical differences, Hartmann argued in his testimony. They were products of different political systems. Democratic governance, for all its apparent inefficiency and messiness, created better intelligence because it allowed for disagreement, for the challenging of authority, for the acknowledgement that leadership could be wrong. Totalitarian systems, by their nature, produced intelligence failures because they could not tolerate information that contradicted power. The American interrogators found this analysis both flattering and uncomfortable. They pressed Hartmann on whether he was simply telling them what they wanted to hear, whether he had constructed a self-serving narrative that positioned him as an enlightened skeptic trapped in a fanatical system. Hartmann acknowledged the possibility but pointed to the documents he had preserved, to the specific instances he could cite where he had written dissenting internal memoranda, to the testimony of other former colleagues who confirmed his reputation as cautious and pessimistic. More importantly, he argued, his testimony could be verified against the documentary record. Everything he had told them about German intelligence assessments, about the distortion of information, about the warnings that had been ignored, could be checked against captured files. He was not asking them to trust his character. He was asking them to examine the evidence. That evidence, as it accumulated through the testimony of Hartmann and hundreds of other former German officials, intelligence officers, and military personnel, revealed the profound dysfunction at the heart of Nazi governance. The Third Reich, which had presented itself as the embodiment of efficiency, organization, and rational planning, had operated largely on ideological fantasy, bureaucratic infighting, and the whims of a leadership that refused to acknowledge reality. German intelligence had not failed because Germans lacked intelligence or technical capability. It had failed because the system demanded that intelligence serve ideology rather than truth, that analysis confirm decisions rather than inform them, that analysts tell leaders what they wanted to hear rather than what they needed to know. In the decades following his debriefing, Hartmann lived quietly in West Germany, working as a translator and occasionally consulting for researchers studying the intelligence war. He gave few interviews, wrote no memoirs, and maintained a deliberate distance from former colleagues who had embraced various forms of denialism about the Nazi period. The American ballpoint pen remained in his possession, kept in a desk drawer as a private reminder of the lesson he had learned too late. In 1961, when American historians and intelligence officials sought to create a comprehensive oral history of German intelligence operations, Hartmann agreed to participate on the condition that his testimony would not be released publicly until after his death. He died in 1979, and the tapes of his interviews were gradually declassified through the 1980s and 1990s, providing researchers with an unprecedented window into the daily operations of Nazi intelligence. What Wilhelm Hartmann understood and what his testimony makes painfully clear is that intelligence is not merely about gathering information. It is about creating systems that can process information honestly, that can acknowledge unwelcome truths, that can speak truth to power even when power does not want to hear it. The Third Reich failed not because it lacked information about Allied capabilities and intentions, but because it had constructed a political system that made honest assessment impossible. Every intelligence failure of the Nazi regime, from the underestimation of Soviet resistance to the miscalculation of American industrial power, stemmed ultimately from the totalitarian nature of the system itself. You cannot build accurate intelligence on foundations of lies. You cannot make sound strategic decisions when your entire governance structure rewards self-deception and punishes truth-telling. You cannot win a war against reality, no matter how powerful your ideology, no matter how fervent your belief. The young man who sat at that desk in Berlin in January 1940, who believed in German superiority and inevitable victory, had his worldview systematically dismantled by the very intelligence he helped collect. The evidence accumulated document by document, report by report, captured supply list by captured supply list, until the gap between belief and reality became unbridgeable. The transformation was not sudden or dramatic. There was no single moment of epiphany, no road to Damascus conversion. It was the slow, grinding process of confronting facts that would not yield to ideology, of watching predictions fail again and again, of seeing the distance between what the Reich claimed and what the Reich could actually accomplish grow wider with each passing month. By the war's end, Hartmann had become what the regime would have considered a traitor. Not because he had actively sabotaged the German war effort, but because he had committed the fundamental sin of totalitarianism. He had stopped believing the lies. His testimony stands now as a monument to a simple truth that transcends the specifics of the Second World War. Free societies, whatever their flaws and failures, possess a structural advantage that no amount of tactical brilliance or technological innovation can overcome. They possess the ability to acknowledge error, to process criticism, to change course when reality demands it. They are inefficient, contentious, and often frustrating precisely because they allow for dissent, for the challenging of authority, for the uncomfortable articulation of unwelcome truths. These qualities, which totalitarian systems view as weaknesses, are actually sources of resilience and strength. A ballpoint pen, mass-produced and disposable, carried more strategic significance than the most advanced German tank because it represented a system that could marshal resources efficiently, that could innovate at scale, that could translate industrial capacity into military power. Wilhelm Hartmann spent the war analyzing intelligence and the rest of his life understanding what that intelligence meant. The lesson he learned, purchased at the cost of his youth and ideals, was that truth is not a luxury in governance. It is the foundation upon which everything else must be built. Without it, all the intelligence in the world amounts to nothing more than organized delusion, and even the most powerful nation is simply marching, with great efficiency and determination, toward its own destruction.